North Gauteng High Court ruling that former President Jacob Zuma will have to pay for his own legal fees. The state should also recoup some of the money already paid towards his legal fees. You'll recall that the DA and the EFF asked the court to declare that it was illegal for the state to continue paying for Zuma's legal costs. The parties wanted the agreement authorizing state funding for his defense in criminal cases set aside. Now, so far, the state has paid up to 32 million rand. Well, that figure is according to the EFF. There's another figure, of course, of 15 or 16 million rand that is being bandied about. But Zuma, as you'll recall, faces charges of fraud, corruption, money laundering and racketeering in connection with the arms deal. For more reaction, political reaction perhaps, I'm joined on the line by Karuma Brown, who is here in Johannesburg. Karuma, good morning to you. Just at the top of your head, does this complicate the former President Jacob Zuma's life, this particular decision?
Absolutely, Collie. I think the big issue here was that for almost 10 years, the state footed the bill for Jacob Zuma's efforts to stay out of a court of law that was the only place to decide his guilt or innocence. He went to great lengths to, of course, insist that he had an agreement with the former president. The problem is that President Cyril Ramaphosa so far couldn't really give us any paperwork that spoke to that agreement, except for the fact that President Zuma had undertaken to sign a document saying that if he was ever found guilty, he would repay the money. So this is a massive, massive victory for South African taxpayers. It means that we don't have to fork out money in a tough economy for a president who, of course, has to stand trial for actions that he is alleged to have committed whilst he was the MEC of Economic Development in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think this is a big blow for not just Zuma, but the Zuma faction. You must remember Tom Moyane was also rejected in the High Court, and the big issue there was that he wanted to essentially be reinstated so that he could be paid, because to have the kind of silks Mike Helens doesn't come cheap. The former president, has 4 silks representing him. It's going to be very interesting to see where he gets the money from now to continue his legal battles.
Because that's exactly the point I explored just a few minutes earlier, Karima, with lawyer Ulrich Roux, that might we see a cutback on that high-powered legal team, seeing that the state is now no longer assisting the former president with these legal costs?
Absolutely. I think you are going to see a diminishing of the amount of legal eagles around former President Jacob Zuma. As you know, even when he was paying the Nkandla money back, he was getting it from VBS, and VBS is now involved in a massive scandal where it actually has come to light that they have in fact robbed poor pensioners and stockpile holders from their monies. And there's no clarity whether President Jacob Zuma actually paid VBS or paid any interest on the money that he has. So he is now in a big financial pickle. And from the days when he was still MEC, President Jacob Zuma has always lived off the largesse of others. And of course, when he was president, it was easy to manipulate the situation in such a way that the costs were in fact incurred by the state. He is now no longer the state president. He is now a man who has to live off what he gets from the state as part of his exit package. And we know, of course, that when it came to the crunch, remember, he didn't want to resign. He eventually resigned because if he didn't, he was going to be left penniless. He was going to lose his pension. So I think that President Jacob Zuma's legal team will now diminish, and I think his political stature to Collie will begin to diminish. President Zuma has been pulling the strings behind the scenes in factional battles inside the African National Congress. He's still been at every National Executive Committee meeting so far, even though it is not common practice for all ex-presidents to attend with the kind of regularity that he does. He really still wanted to influence the way in which the African National Congress conducts itself. I think this is now going to be a major blow to that Fight Back campaign.
Karuma, you and I know that the former president is notorious for appealing and constantly appealing. Now that this decision has come, do you foresee him trying to appeal this particular judgment?
Look, what is interesting is when there was a personal cost order against President Zuma, and also when the EFF made Michael Hulley the target of the campaign, saying that Hulley will have to cough up the cost. Hulley was dropped from the legal team, and Hulley was with President Zuma from the very beginning. And then, of course, he got Mike Helens, and he got this other team. And I'm sure his political associates, whom he has enriched through state capture, have been forking out money. But he's looking like a man who's literally run out of time, rope, and road. And as a consequence, he is going to be a bad political bet, even for those in the African National Congress who would have hoped for an early National General Council. I think President Jacob Zuma's political stature will now diminish. And I think that the laughing, confident man that constantly addresses supporters after his court appearance, I think all of that is going to change now, because he literally has to find hundreds of thousands of rands to pay his legal fees. And as happy as Michael Helens is to be his lawyer, he's not going to be working for free.
Yeah, I'd say it really complicates his life. Talk to me, Karuma, about President Cyril Ramaphosa. What we know from his office thus far, on record, he has said that he will abide by the court's decision on this particular matter. Do you foresee them changing that stance?
No, not at all. I think President Cyril Ramaphosa has done exactly the right thing, the ethical thing. When he came into office, he inherited a set of regulations regarding President Jacob Zuma. He said that there's very little documentation. There was only the undertaking that President Zuma would pay if he was ever found guilty. We know that President Zuma spent a decade trying to remain out of court, so he couldn't get to a verdict. But what Cyril Ramaphosa has done is he has allowed the judiciary to run this process. As the executive, he can't intervene in this matter. All he said was that he is going to be law-abiding, and he is going to effectively adhere to what the court says. So he doesn't incur any political cost in a divided ANC, because he is simply complying with a court decision. And remember, the big renewal program in the African National Congress is to bring credibility to state institutions, to bring credibility and stability to institutions that have been hollowed out. And one of the institutions that has been hollowed out has been the NPA. We now have Shamila Batoy as the head of the NPA. We saw there the president also didn't make it a political process. He actually consulted, civil society organizations. So he's actually played it incredibly strategically and cleverly. He is essentially now bound by a court decision. The ANC cannot come out against the court and criticize the court. But in an NEC meeting, the president is not going to be able to be accused of conniving against President Jacob Zuma. All he said was that the courts must decide and he will abide. And that is, of course, what the first citizen of the country must do. The first citizen of the country must respect the judiciary and respect court outcomes. And that is precisely what Cyril Ramaphosa has done. So a very smart, clever political move, which will have very little consequence in terms of political heat that he would have taken if he was seen to be interfering with the matter. He's stuck to his guns, saying, I've got this agreement, I've got to honor this agreement, but if there are court challenges, I am going to abide by the court. And that's precisely what he's done. And I think that it's a boon for President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has essentially said that he is someone that will uphold the Constitution, respect the different arms of government, respect the separation of powers, and of course this is a court decision. And those in the African National Congress that will try and use this as a way to say he's trying to weaken President Zuma won't have any leg to stand on, because they would then have to say the president must defy the court, and the president can't do that.
Karuma, there's another element that you introduced earlier, and I want to explore that now, that President Ramaphosa could not produce this agreement allegedly signed between the then President Thabo Mbeki and the State Attorney's Office at the time. The fact that President Ramaphosa could not produce this agreement, perhaps in court, does that say anything, or does that paint the former President Thabo Mbeki in a particular light in the eyes of the Republic, in as far as what was the basis then of the state footing the bill for former President Jacob Zuma's legal costs?
You see, the big thing here, Collie, is that there has to be legal, rational arguments for why the state do things. You know, our law requires that. It must pass constitutional muster and it must be rational. So what people were looking for, especially the opposition, was what was the guidelines. And of course, the former president's argument was that he was charged when he was still a minister. But he was charged for corruption. So you're not a minister to perform corruption. So that in itself was already a big, issue that one could pick with the basis for which Thabo Mbeki had agreed to pay former President Jacob Zuma's legal costs. I know for a fact that when Karuma Brown was the president for a short while, there was a big legal wrangle between Zuma's team and Motlante's advisors about how to pay the money, and they were often hassled. And that is part of the tension that emerged between Karuma Brown and President Jacob Zuma, because Karuma Brown was also trying to find out what is the legal basis for continuing to pay this cost. And the president, as I said, was able to produce a signed note by President Zuma that he would repay the money back, which presupposed that there was an agreement, that there was an acceptance by all parties that they could carry the cost because he was charged in the execution of his duties. But the actual argument that one can put forward with quite a lot of authenticity is, if you elect someone into public office, you don't expect them to commit corruption. So if they're charged with corruption, why ought the state to be paying for them? Because they don't take an oath of office to practice corruption and enrich themselves. Exactly. They, in fact, serve the people. So I think people will ask questions about that original agreement that was signed, Collie.
And this is what I want to quickly find out from you before I let you go, that does this then have implications for those who are currently going to go through the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, because that same argument that they might mount, which the former president relied on, that whatever misdeeds may have been committed, they would have been committed during the course of my execution of official duties, that argument surely won't stand up now.
No, it can't stand up, because you're not elected to perform acts of illegality. So let's say, for example, someone like Malusi Gigaba, who has already been, fingered by Parliament's probe into corruption at Eskom as someone who needs to be investigated. The same goes for Lynn Brown. They can't say this happened during the time of my tenure in office, and therefore I have the right to be supported by the state. When you take an oath of office, you take an oath of office to serve the people of South Africa. You don't take an oath of office to use your office to collude with your friends to crook the system. So it's going to be very hard for people to actually argue that the state must pay their legal fees. And I think this is going to affect the political posture of a lot of the people who believe that the margin with which President Ramaphosa came to power was so narrow that they could outmaneuver him. We know the list processes are on. There's a lot of rumors that President Zuma is trying to influence who gets on the list and so on. And I think this reality, because, politics are about sets of interests, and it's always financial interests. And if you have to pay out of your own pocket, then the matters change. We saw the same thing with Mr. Claudia Mutwaneng at the SABC, and we saw the same thing with Patabile Dlamini when she was hit with part of that cost order. And then, of course, the new powers that the Auditor General has, where people are going to be held financially liable for what they sign off on. These are all the results of what President Ramaphosa promised us in his State of the Nation address, which was consequence management, that if you do something wrong when you are in office, there's not going to be an assumption that the state is naturally going to stand by you, because when you're elected into office, you're elected to serve the people. You're not elected to misuse your office. So there's no automatic right that you must be assisted by the state. And I think this is going to have massive political ramifications. I can think of someone like Suprama Umapelo, the Premier. I can think of people like Ace Magashule. I can think of people like Mosibenzi Zwane, Lynn Brown, people like David Mahlobo. There's going to be a lot of people that's going to have to dig into their own pockets to fund their own legal costs if they get to the point where they have to face criminal prosecution.
All right, Karuma Brown, thank you very much for that insight. Karuma Brown, a political analyst, joining us on the line from here in Johannesburg. Let's